There were quite a few shows that came out in late 2022, and unfortunately I was unable to review all of them in a timely manner. Yeah, I apologize for not being able to talk about these shows. I really wanted to, but there was a horrible little thing that happened that was called writer's block. However, just because the last digit on the calendar is now a 3, didn't mean I wasn't going to be talking about these shows at all. Heck, I had actually started separate video scripts on at least 2 of these, but they really weren't working out that well and wouldn't be up to the standard I wanted them to be. So I decided to put them all in this neat little catch-up video instead, and have all of my thoughts condensed enough where I'm not just gonna drone on and on and on and on about stupid parts about these things, and I'm gonna get right to the point. So let's get right into these reviews, starting with Yep, I'm finally talking about an MCU show, and what better one to start with than the one that caused an uproar among people because a scene involved twerking. Oh, this is gonna be good. If you've watched my channel for a decent amount of time, you would probably notice that I've never actually covered any of the MCU TV shows like WandaVision or Loki, and that's mostly because of one simple reason. They all kinda share the exact same issues. They all start off with a couple of good episodes with a really interesting hook, but then fall into mediocrity around the middle and completely nosedive at the finale. It's pretty much been the same thing across the board, and while I can't really say that any of the shows are necessarily bad, I can't really say that they're amazing. The shows never really justified themselves being shows. None of them benefited from the television format and felt like an extended movie that would have been better as an hour-long special instead. And I think Marvel realized this too, since they've been playing more around with the idea of special presentations, which I think have been a much better format, with the ones like Werewolf by Night being probably the best Marvel thing to have come out of Disney+. I think a show like Moon Knight would have been much better as a special presentation, since the story would have to be reworked in a way to accommodate for the smaller runtime, on top of removing most of the stupid crap that happens, like in the finale when it turns into Godzilla vs. Kong. But I'm getting way too sidetracked. The point is that pretty much none of the shows really justify themselves being TV shows. Except for She-Hulk. It was the only show that I believed made sense to be an actual show. The character is a perfect fit for an episodic format and allows the writers to come up with fun scenarios without having to fit them into some big overall story. The comedic nature of the character as well made her a prime candidate for the comedy-heavy project, with well-written jokes, and it would just be a fun way to get away from all the stupid stuff that's been going on in the MCU as of late, with universe-ending threats that have been going on in all of the films and even a lot of the shows. Just getting back down to basics. So, was She-Hulk good? No, it wasn't. The show wasn't very good, but it also wasn't an insanely terrible show either. I hoped it would be good, and I wanted to give this show the benefit of the doubt. I really did. But I just can't bring myself to say that it is, and that really bums me out, because I was looking forward to this one a bit. It seemed a little different than a lot of the stuff in the MCU as of late, so that's what immediately got me hooked. And look, if you really like this show and think it's the best Marvel Disney Plus show thus far, and it's your favorite TV show or something like that, whatever, more power to you. I'm happy you're able to get enjoyment out of this show. And to other people who hate the show with a burning passion and think it's woke and hates men and all that crap, please click off of this video, because I'm not taking that side whatsoever, and I think it's pretty pathetic if you do. I'm looking at this with a critical mindset to point out objective flaws within it while also talking about the good stuff here too, because I don't think the show is entirely bad. For starters, the world building that the show does here is pretty good for the most part. I enjoy the idea of superhero related shenanigans finally being brought up in a court setting, and I think it's pretty damn funny. And that's honestly my favorite part. The courtroom stuff involving MCU shenanigans were really fun. Like a case involving Wong suing a phony magician who used to be an actual sorcerer who's just endangering people is really funny and clever. Or the one involving Mr. Immortal, who literally couldn't die and faked his death instead of going to divorce court with more than 10 different women. That's just just funny. Plus, other aspects, such as there being a superhero suit designer, were really neat additions and honestly made sense in the world. Really, everything introduced here makes sense. Instead of trying to expand the MCU, the show is making it deeper and building upon some of the stuff already present, which has been sorely lacking since the beginning of Phase 4. So that's a pretty big plus here, and it was nice not having to worry about the planet being destroyed by some eldritch horror coming to devour our reality. It's just a very laid-back and relaxed kind of show. It also presents itself as a comedy, which I think was a smart move, since the other MCU shows, besides Miss Marvel perhaps, were much more serious in tone. So She-Hulk is able to be different in that regard. The problem with that, though, is that the MCU is already a comedy. Like, Multiverse of Madness, although being a little darker, had a lot of comedy in it. Moon Knight did a lot of silly stuff with the usual Marvel dialogue and with the character like Steven being very comedic. And hell, Love and Thunder was straight up the most comedic the MCU has attempted to be. So although the show may be the most unique compared to other Disney Plus MCU shows, it still falls in line with the Marvel isms that have been a bit of a detriment to the franchise as of recently. None of the comedy was really that funny, and I can't say any of it was downright bad. But for pretty much the whole thing, it was all kind of just the same quippy, sarcastic kind of comedy that we've been seeing since the Avengers back in 2012. And similar to the comedy, the characters as well were all just kind of there. No one was bad necessarily, but no one was truly memorable. Besides the main character Jen, who doesn't exactly have the best introduction with an origin story I felt was rushed somewhat and was never really explained, she's then made out as fairly unlikable, especially with her interactions with Bruce, where she's unnecessarily arrogant. It really was not a good start for her. But she becomes much better after that first episode and is pretty fun to be around. Though, unfortunately, the show doesn't really do anything that entertaining. A lot of people said that this show was a massive dumpster fire, which I can't agree with, since the show is just dull. Nothing more. On top of the repetitive comedy, there's nothing really that fun or interesting going on. It's just all kind of just a big blur with occasional neat things, like the aforementioned episode with Wong, or the Daredevil episode, which was the best one out of the whole thing. But besides those episodes, and maybe a couple other moments here and there, it was all just kind of just meh. I can't really remember most of the stuff that happened in most episodes because they were just so uneventful. None of them were necessarily awful, but they were just boring. And by the time the finale happened, I was just totally apathetic to the whole thing. I just didn't care anymore. And the finale, I will unfortunately say, did leave a bad taste in my mouth after the whole show, because of how poorly the whole thing was executed. The show set up specific things throughout, like with King Hulk, and it turned out to be pretty lame and very stupid. But then all of that doesn't matter with the massive fourth wall break, since that pretty much negates any setup before this, and the massive fourth wall break itself was just jarring to me. Kinda funny, but jarring, especially how the show went from Jen just talking to the viewer with casual fourth wall breaking to literally breaking through Disney Plus and interacting with the real world. And yeah, I get that this is what her character does, and it's something that she does in the comics, but this is a TV show, not a comic book. Certain things just aren't gonna translate well, and I think this was one of those things. And yeah, I get someone like Deadpool does that, but at the same time, I think it's at least written better. And I didn't find the show making fun of itself by saying the MCU was created by a machine to churn out products very funny, especially when that's kind of what's going on with the amount of films and TV shows being forced out, and VFX studios are being treated like shit. So yeah, when they make jokes about that, no thank you. That's just tasteless and kinda gross more than anything else to me. And to quickly get that out of the way, yeah, for the most part the CGI isn't that amazing here. But I mean, that's for most of the shows in general, so this really isn't that much of a shock. But it's made worse since the main character is CGI for a good chunk of the time. But then it's kinda weird as well, because sometimes the CG can be really good. I mean, She-Hulk can look really good at points and fits in with everyone else. But then at other points, it gets absolutely be terrible. And again, this is an issue that's been plaguing Marvel projects as of recent. You can really tell the VFX studios are being worked to the bone here, especially when having to coincide with the movies. So it's even more sad that shows like this are having to suffer because executives aren't giving enough time to hardworking people. But look, the overall main issues with this show were the lackluster story, characters, and writing. Just because this show didn't have a grand overall story isn't what makes it bad. The episodic storytelling was actually a strength, but it's how boring some of those plots were, like Jen going to a wedding, which we didn't actually see. But honest to God, I really don't know what else I could say about the show. I've pretty much run out of steam, and I don't think it's an insane garbage fire like some people have made this show out to be, but I can't really call it good either. It's just overall kind of disappointing. So with all that being said, She-Hulk Attorney at Law is nothing better than a 4 out of 10. Cyberpunk Edgerunners made me sad, but in the absolute best way possible. This is going to be a really quick review on Edgerunners, mostly because I don't have much to say about it, because it's just a really solid show. Instead of trying to adapt the story from the game, Cyberpunk Edgerunners opts to instead be an original story, following entirely different characters that just so happen to be in the same setting. Personally, I think that was a smart move, since it doesn't limit what the writers could do. If they were trying to adapt the game's story, there would be issues.
If I need your body, I'll fucking... Dick. Why do you come? Welcome.
But this instead gives them a lot of freedom to do anything they want with an already created world for them to do stuff in. The story revolves around David Martinez, a kid in the lower class of society who's looked down upon by his peers because of his social status. His life then goes straight down the drain in the blink of an eye, and after acquiring an advanced piece of military tech, turns to a life of crime and joins the cyberpunk group, the Edgerunners. There really isn't that much to say about the story besides a couple of things here and there. Really, it's just here to keep stuff moving along. However, the main focus here are the characters, and they're all great. The show gets you invested into every single one of them so quickly, and they're all so charming and fun. You want David to find success, you want Lucy to be happy, you want Maine to stay awesome, you want Rebecca to continue being insane. And then the show continues. Watching every single character die one by one and being horrified and depressed by it is a testament to how important good character writing is and how powerful it can be. Even the smallest side character getting blown to bits can get a reaction out of you here. Edgerunners just tugs at your heartstrings whenever it can, telling a tale of someone who was at the bottom and for a moment made it to the top. But like the ideas presented in the show, anything can happen. This isn't a fantasy, it's reality. In a world as corrupt and evil as this one, not everyone is going to make it out. It isn't like other stories where most of the main characters have plot armor and can just walk away from just about anything. Because here, almost the entire cast gets killed, and just because David is the main character didn't automatically mean he was going to make it through this. And honestly, even though every single character does die, all of their deaths mean something, and it's incredible. Especially for certain characters that might not have had a lot of dialogue. It's just crazy, especially the finale, which really did put a very shocked expression on my face. But at the same time, the show isn't just all doom and gloom. The animation is an absolute treat to watch. Done by Studio Trigger, the same guys responsible for Kill la Kill and that Star Wars Vision short I talked about a year back. They are absolute masters when it comes to conveying motion and power, which especially makes the action here amazing. From the firefights and chases, it all looks stunning and really gets you sucked in. You almost can't look away from all of the stuff going on. And towards the end of the series, the ante gets cranked up to 11. It's insane. What really sells the action though and makes it feel so visceral is how choppy everything is, with it being animated at a slower frame rate. That really made the punches hit harder, the guns shots have more kickback, and chases feel fast and intense. Although I couldn't get over the fact that when David used the Sandevistan, it reminded me of the Super Mario Galaxy Rainbow Star power-up. Like, I couldn't have been the only one who made that connection. And throughout the whole show, everything is almost perfect. Almost. You see, there was only one real problem, and that was how the characters weren't as fleshed out as they probably could have been. I mean, as cool and relaxed as this guy was, I honest to God could not tell you his name, and I pretty much just started calling him McCree.
Thank you kindly.
And he only has a limited amount of screen time and only has a bit more by the last 2 episodes. And yet, he's the only other teammate besides Lucy to not die by the end of the show, so that was a little odd. Kiwi was also another character who we see sells out the whole group by the end of the show and then eventually tries to make amends with them before she's killed. But there really isn't anything that shows that she would have sold them out to begin with. She wasn't developed enough for me to care about her turning on them or when she died. I didn't really have a reaction to her portrayal at all. It was just a, oh, how about that kind of moment, which I'm guessing wasn't the intent. There's a couple other characters that should have gotten a little more done with them as well, but the ones who are focused on here are so likable that it doesn't matter too much overall. So Cyberpunk Edgerunners was a fantastic little show that got me invested into characters so much that it actually hurt me to see them die one by one. The animation was terrific, the action was insane. The dialogue felt real, and it worked all so well together. Though some people have apparently had an issue with the show not continuing with the second season, but I would argue that not every show needs to have multiple seasons and can be short, and this show did that well. Plus the show ended in a way where everything is pretty much wrapped up in a neat little bow. There's nothing more for it to say, and there really isn't that much more for me to say either. So, Cyberpunk Edgerunners gets nothing less than a 9 out of 10.
That was really bad.
You know, I hoped this show was good. I hoped that people who said it wasn't were wrong, because I thought people were overreacting once again to another show that wasn't actually that bad. But damn it, The Lord of the Rings of Power wasn't very good. I was legitimately left feeling sad after watching this show, because I wanted this to be good. I wanted the reaction everyone had to it to be overblown, which it was, but it wasn't unfounded. Because there was so much wrong with this show that it honestly surprised me. Simple things like story pacing were screwed up here all the way at the very beginning, and not like particularly in the first couple of episodes. I mean, the literal opening of episode 1 of this entire show is where all this starts to go wrong. Something that I noticed almost immediately when going into this show was how lost I was. The beginning of the show doesn't do a great job at setting everything up. It takes about 17 minutes until the setup for the Hunt Down Sauron plotline finishes up, and time can be given to other plots. The show desperately needed a Fellowship of the Ring style opening that would have helped set up the world in a less confusing way, presenting the war against Morgoth and how powerful he was and who he was, on top of streamlining all the information in a way that's much more simple for the audience to understand without having to Google search every damn noun characters say. Because unless you're a Tolkien lore nut, you're not gonna have any idea of what most of the stuff is, like a Morgoth or Valinor. And this is coming from a semi-casual Lord of the Rings enjoyer, where I know a lot of the locations and fairly decent chunk about the lore. So if even someone like me is confused to the point of having to pause the show and go look onto the wiki to see what the hell these guys are talking about then you've messed up. This probably has to do with, and if you didn't know, the Rings of Power not being a direct adaptation of the Silmarillion. Unfortunately, the show doesn't even scratch that Tolkien lore itch, since it actually changes the lore. And look, I'd be 100% fine with series lore being changed in something if it helps benefit the story, but that's not the case here. Instead of weaving a story around the lore presented, the showrunners decided to twist and contort it to work with the story they wanted to tell instead. And really, the story that they wanted to tell here was pretty damn disjointed, as it's split up into like 4 different plots, all going on at the same time, which also include subplots of their own. The first and most important plot revolves around Galadriel. Yes, that Galadriel, as she's hunting down Sauron out of revenge for killing her brother. However, this already marks the first issue of the show, and we're not even 10 minutes into it. Besides the whole lore issue thing like I mentioned, we never really actually get to know her brother at all before he dies. I guess he's a really nice guy or something when he's talking to her as a child, but that's all we get from him. We never get any interactions between the two, not even when Galadriel is an adult. So the whole reason as to why she's hunting down Sauron means nothing because we don't even understand her motivations fully or sympathize with her fully. This issue plagues the rest of the show, and it's not super helped when Galadriel honestly comes off as a super hostile person when anyone is trying to help her with her quest, which is like the only trait I remember her having, since she really does not show off anything else other than bitterness. I mean, for God's sake, she's looking at a volcano erupting in front of her and she's not even emoting a little bit compared to everyone else screaming and running. And if you don't like Galadriel, don't worry, because as this plot progresses, we meet new characters like Ocean Man, Queen Lady, that guy, rip off Aragorn, and a ton of other characters that aren't fleshed out enough for me to care either. The other big issue here is that there are just too many characters to keep track of, which really isn't a good sign, when there's already a full cast worth of characters in just this plotline, and we haven't even gotten to the others yet. The show tries to get you to relate to some of these characters, like with Ripoff Aragorn, having a son who has different goals than what he wants for him, but the show never really gives enough time to that subplot to make it more fleshed out. It's always about finding Sauron, so whenever we get close to knowing that personal struggles these characters are going through, it's cut off by the main story going on. The next plot has to do with this village of people defending themselves against a small army of orcs, led by this guy, who we learn nothing about, while following the not very well fleshed out romance between this elf and human. And that's about it for that plot. It really is just a back and forth between these people defending their village and losing it to orcs. Although there is an interesting mystery set up in it, it doesn't really play a big factor until Galadriel's plot meets up with this one. So while the story is going nowhere, the characters really don't help it out either, since none of them have any discernible traits. Elfman is just a stoic good guy who's in love with this lady, and that lady is a good person who wants to defend her village. That's legitimately all there is to these people. I cannot for the life of me remember what their names were. They were just like generic fantasy characters, which is really insulting when this is supposed to be Lord of the Rings. Then there's the plot about Elrond and his dwarf friend Durin, and honestly, this is the best storyline of the show. It doesn't only focus on moving the plot forward, but it actually takes its time with the characters. We actually get to see the friendship between these two and how they interact with others, and it's pretty damn sweet. It takes time with developing the characters here, while simultaneously progressing the plot forward, going from Elrond getting the dwarves' help in a major project to discovering Mithril and using it to save the elves. But while that's going on, we see the conflict between Durin and his father and his wife, and again, that kind of stuff helps develop the characters here beyond whatever the plot requires. And finally, there's the Harfoot plot, which doesn't tie into the main story revolving around Sauron in the Southlands at all, following dollar store hobbits as they get caught up with the wizard and this merry band of idiots. So there really isn't anything to discuss with them besides the fact that this whole plotline takes away time from the other ones. The absolute biggest offense the show commits is having absolutely boring and uninteresting characters, which, like I said before, is pretty unacceptable for something a part of Lord of the Rings. Besides the characters that were either in the original trilogy, named dropped constantly throughout it, or happened to be this guy, who is also technically this guy, I could not for the life of me tell you who the hell any of these people are. No one makes a lasting impression, and all of them are the most generic characters ever. The fact here is that the show prioritized the story above everything else. Almost every character here does nothing but push the plot forward. Anytime it seems like we're about to learn something new about a character, it just turns into them discussing what's currently going on. It's why the plot involving Elrond and Durin was so much better than all the others, because the show focused somewhat on their character development. They're not constantly discussing the whole plan about building that forge to create the rings. They talk about their friendship and how they feel about certain things. It's stuff like that that makes the plot significantly more interesting than all the others, because it felt more alive. I'm going to remember little moments like this over anything else in the entire show.
I've been remiss in not visiting sooner. An oversight for which I am here to humbly ask forgiveness.
You're staying for dinner.
He's leaving.
He's staying.
He's leaving.
He's staying.
But the saddest thing to me about this whole show is that I could have talked about the beautiful music used, or the fantastic adaptation of locations and designs from the books, or the absolutely incredible production design, with everything looking stunning, from the sets, the costumes, the CG. It was all truly incredible. You can definitely see there was a lot of money thrown towards this, but with how hollow the writing and characters are, none of that mattered. It doesn't matter how breathtaking the whole thing looked and sounded, because at the end of the day, I knew I didn't care about the characters or story, and if I wanted to see breathtaking sights involving no story whatsoever, I would have watched something on National Geographic's instead. The reason why The Lord of the Rings worked wasn't because of the beautiful locations or the groundbreaking CGI or the large-scale battles, but because the characters were great. They weren't just tools to solely push the plot forward, they had moments to share their desires and fears, moments where they were joking around with one another. None of that was present here, besides a couple of times, and that to me was the biggest reason as to why it just didn't work. I do think overall the response to the show was overblown, in the same way that people reacted to She-Hulk, but at the same time, just because the reaction was superfluous doesn't mean that all of the claims were unfounded. The show still had bad writing, poorly developed characters, and a plot that goes nowhere for a majority of the runtime. So, sadly, I'm giving Lord of the Rings of Power, and I hate that title, by the way, like, for God's sake, just call it Rings of Power, a 3 out of 10. Andor is the least Star Wars thing to have come out of the whole franchise, having an extremely slow pace, barely any action, having characters talk to each other more than anything else, very little spectacle, and it was such a breath of fresh air. When I first saw Lucasfilm's slate of new films and TV shows coming out, my reaction was pretty much, yes, yes, yeah! I mean, let's be real, out of the whole plethora of interesting Star Wars characters with detailed backstories and legends or characters from there that have yet to make their canon debut, doing a show based on Cassian Andor from Rogue One was not exactly the most interesting choice. But apparently, instead of being mediocre and somewhat forgettable like Obi-Wan in the Book of Boba Fett, Andor instead chose to be one of the best pieces of media to have come out of the Star Wars franchise since probably the Siege of Mandalore and the Clone Wars. Now, I love Star Wars, but I don't think it would be that much of a hot take to say that it hasn't been amazing as of late, with most of the content being put out being less than adequate, with the aforementioned Obi-Wan and Boba Fett series overall being disappointing. However, the thing that hurt those series more was the fact that they had beloved characters as the leads, so the overall disappointing nature was made even worse since those characters weren't done as much justice as they deserved. So, with Andor focusing on a character nobody really remembered or cared for that much, made this show free from the high expectations the fanbase would have about it compared to anyone else. And the show really doesn't have that much Star Wars related stuff in it. Like, there's stormtroopers and TIE fighters and things like that here and there, but none of it gets in the way. That was one of the major issues that plagued Rogue One, which was trying to be a more serious and grounded Star Wars story, but constantly had to shove tons of stuff in that didn't really make sense and just felt like fan service for the sake of it.
ATSTs! ATSTs! C-3PO and R2-D2 showed up, and I clapped!
I clapped when I saw them, too!
I clapped because I know Star Wars!
I know what that is!
When we see stormtroopers here, it's only when they're in the background guarding Imperial buildings or as a part of an occupying Imperial force on a planet. When we see a TIE fighter, it's used to show how powerful and terrifying the Empire looks to average people, not just cannon fodder for the heroes to blow up. Oh, okay, besides that moment, Andor is able to use the Star Wars universe and the iconic imagery from it as a way to tell grounded stories rather than having them be a crutch. The show is pretty much able to do anything with Andor himself, apart from the obvious. And with the story taking place away from most of the planets we're familiar with, it grants the writers the ability to do whatever they want with them, and it still makes sense. I don't think anybody was really that hell-bent on going back to Tatooine for the 50th time, or any other desert planet in general, and since the show didn't do that, it lets us see way more variety. And the other locations seen on the different planets were really interesting, such as the dirty industrial planet Ferrix with brick buildings lining the streets and workers constantly on the move, to the elegant and beautiful high-rise apartments on Coruscant showing how detached people with that kind of luxury are with the rest of the galaxy. And the ideas like that are pretty much what makes Andor interesting, since it delves deeper into the Star Wars stuff we already know, tackling things like exploitation of the lower classes, the rich and powerful being removed from average society, secret agency cover-ups, political intrigue, prison systems using the people they have as slave labor, and a whole slew of other fascinating things. And each of these ideas are used throughout the whole show and build upon each other to create an interesting story. And the whole show splits its entire story into 3 separate chunks, with the first being the setup for everything, the second being about the heist, and the third being about the prison escape and finale, all of which are interesting and don't feel out of place. You'd think it's a little bit jarring moving from one specific story to another, but it isn't. All of these plots are expertly tied together with no issues, and they all work together so perfectly. The world building as well is pretty awesome. We get to see some of the ways the rebellion operates with undercover operatives and how there's different cells within them, how citizens on multiple worlds are treated differently, with some having it much easier than others with that separation of wealth and power, how ordinary people are affected by the regime and what their daily lives are like, and how they can be immediately screwed over for doing nothing and basically enslaved. One of the strongest things that the show did was flesh out the Empire more than ever before, in showing the inner workings of it. We get to see how a subdivision like the ISB is run and the competitive nature of it between those who work there, as well as how methodical they can be, performing investigations before committing military resources or staging traps in such detailed manners while trying to think like the enemy. It really helps make the Empire more insidious, honestly, showing us how in-depth the scheming is with them and how they subjugate people, as if they were the inner workings of a machine. And I also need to bring attention to the dialogue as well, because it is some of the best to have come out of the franchise. Again, since it doesn't really have to deal with a ton of sci-fi mumbo-jumbo you would see in regular Star Wars stuff, and grounds the characters in a dark, depressing world, it makes everything feel real. Like, I don't know if it was just because of the minuscule amount of Star Wars iconography that was present here, or just because the overall show took itself seriously, but when someone is talking, they sound like a real person, and not an MCU film or an elementary school play. I kinda like the fact that the dialogue is far from what most would expect from regular Star Wars.
I wish that I could just wish away my feelings.
But then the show takes it to another level when we see incredible scenes like the speech Andy Serkis gives about everyone rising up and escaping from the prison, being truly inspiring. But then it doesn't stop there, because in the exact same episode, less than like 5 minutes later, Lutheran gives his own monologue about what he's sacrificing for the rebellion and a son he'll never see. It's just so powerful. The show just does so many moments like this so well, where there's no need for lightsaber duels or space battles in order to get you to remember something. The dialogue is strong enough for it to be the most memorable part of this show. And the show as well helps spread its message and ideas through the characters expertly, giving Cassian Andor a personality beyond his gruff rebel man persona in Rogue One, showing the lengths people will go to in pursuit of freedom and liberty with Lutheran, who's given his entire life to the cause, or how some people with perfect-looking lives can be in a prison of their own and do whatever they can to help causes like the Rebellion, even if they're the closest to being burned by the Empire, like with Mon Mothma and her story. Every single character has something to them that gets me invested in who they are and what they're about. But it's not only that, since the show is able to get you to invest in characters that you only follow for a small amount of time. Andy Serkis is only in 3 out of the 12 episodes here, and yet his character said this in his last episode.
What happened now? We made it! What's wrong? Can't swim. What? What did he say? Can't swim.
And then that got me to react like this. It just goes to show how well written this all is, especially in comparison to other Star Wars shows that we've seen recently that haven't exactly been that amazing. But honestly, there really isn't anything I can think of that truly brings this show down, and anything I can think of is pretty nitpicky, honestly. I mean, I guess the pacing, as many others have pointed out, is a little slow, which slow pacing isn't a bad thing if it benefits the show, which it does here, but certain parts such as the beginning arc of the show drag on a little bit, and could have been a little quicker to get things started, but that's really it. I am pleasantly surprised with how good this show turned out, and it's gonna be a while till we get season 2, so hopefully upcoming shows like The Acolyte and Ahsoka can be as well crafted as this one is. So with all of that out of the way, Andor rightfully deserves a 10 out of 10. Finally, I'm done talking about these shows. The amount of writer's block I got from these was frustrating to say the least. But I'm done here. It was an overall mixed bag, with some being pretty bad and some being ungodly good. Hopefully the stuff to come out this year will be a little more consistent. But what were your guys' thoughts on these shows? Did you agree or disagree with me? Leave a comment, let me know what you thought. I'll see you all next time, guys. Thanks for watching.